and I'm speaking today with Dr. Bill Werner, who's the director of politicalislam.com. It's a website where you can find educational materials and many books and his biography. He's a tremendous scholar and a source of information on Islam. Sir, we're here today to discuss your book entitled The Doctrine of Slavery, an Islamic Institution. And I'm struck by two things initially: how much original source material this book contains. It's so much original source material because, of course, if you were to write these things about Islamic doctrine, people would say that you're interpreting it, whereas you're actually letting the original source material speak for itself. Have you ever been accused of plagiarism?
Actually, I think that's one of the few things I've never been accused of, because I've been accused of just about anything else.
Well, good for you. This book, The Doctrine of Slavery, an Islamic Institution, is available at Dr. Bill Werner's website, politicalislam.com. And the title this morning, that's the first question I have for you, is the title itself really jumped out at me. I've had this book that you sent me very graciously. I've had it for a week now to peruse over, but this morning I saw the title for the first time. In fact, you're just saying, look, folks, this is an institution of Islamic thought.
Yes, and it's a core one. I mean, the Islam directly speaks to the fact that the kafir can be enslaved. And it's a virtuous thing because you see the only way out of your slavery is to become a Muslim. So therefore, this making a kafir a slave is actually an act of virtue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a great deal of discussion in Islam about, the fact that slavery is the natural order of society and pleasing to Allah, isn't it?
Yes. Now, oddly enough, there's one class of people, of course, who cannot be enslaved: Muslims.
Is that why Muhammad would treat Muslim women with respect and not even touch them, whereas for non?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Muhammad would not even touch another Muslim woman, and yet he would rape a kafir woman. So he had a definite, well, this is part of a dualistic ethical system, but slavery is based on dualistic ethics. That is, one set of rules for one set of people and another set of rules for another set of people.
Dualistic ethics is that whole notion that this is how we treat the kafir. The rules for the kafir are different for the rule than from the rules for our own people.
Exactly. For instance, some ethical rules in Islam are a Muslim doesn't touch another Muslim's wife, a Muslim doesn't cheat another Muslim, a Muslim doesn't lie to another Muslim, and so on. Now, Wes, if you'll notice, you and I aren't on that list. A Muslim treats another Muslim as a brother, but they're not going to treat me as a Muslim and as a brother. So there's dualistic ethics explains a lot about Islam. As a matter of fact, Islam is based on dualism. Just about on every subject, Islam has two points of view. This is the reason when you read the Quran and it's so contradictory, you go, wait a minute, which of these is right?
There's another.
They're both right.
They're both right, and they're able to keep those two ideas in distinctive compartments in their mind, so that dualism exists without any sense of disturbance in their thought process. Yeah.
Now, a Muslim is not supposed to lie unless it will advance Islam.
Mm-hmm. So there's one point here: after the jihad that captures the slaves is over, the slaves are to be treated well. I mean, don't the future slaves at least have that to look forward to in their captivity?
Well, theoretically, they are supposed to be treated well. They're supposed to wear the same kind of clothes, eat the same kind of food. And yet, somehow or another, this does not turn out to be something that I would want to join. Because I've got a feeling this would be anchored in failure more than success, the whole idea.
Isn't it astonishing that slavery continues into the afterlife, into paradise as well? Would you want to talk a little bit about the slavery that exists that Jewish women and Christian women have to look forward to in the afterlife?
Well, one of the things that will happen in the afterlife, if your judgment, and on Judgment Day you get to go to paradise, of course, there you have endless women to satisfy your pleasures. And oddly enough, it doesn't speak if the women who go to paradise get to have infinite number of men for sex, but probably not.
Hmm. Hmm. Not that they would really want that. I mean, the odds are good, but the goods are odd, so to speak.
Ha! Ha! I'm going
Sorry.
to steal that at some time.
Use it freely. There's no copyright on that. I learned it from a woman from Alaska. So imagine her predicament. But let's get into how Islam has a detailed language and legal code for the treatment of slaves. And what are some of the aspects that turn up in language where the word slave, uh, abid, in other words, I mean, we know that's the same word for the color black because slaves were so prevalent in the Islamic world that the word black, the color black, became the word for slave. Would you have any thoughts on that?
Well, Islam has a detailed language of slavery. One of my favorite examples is in English, we have only one word for slave, which is slave. But in Arabic, you have words like this, an Arabic word which will describe a male slave who has escaped. They also have a separate word for a female slave that has escaped, and a third word for a child slave that has escaped. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that we're dealing with a detailed technical language. I sat down with an Arabic dictionary and came up with, I think, over 40 different names for slave in the Arabic literature. And I found this to be incredible because what it reminded me of, I don't know if this is true or not, but they say that Eskimos have a vast language of a vast collection of nouns for snow because there's all kinds of snow. But down here in Tennessee, we don't have that detailed knowledge in words for snow because we don't have that much to do with it. So if you have a detailed technical language, it says there's something behind that. And so what's behind it is that Islam is the greatest enslaver of humans that the world has ever seen.
It might also indicate at one point in your book you speak about how they were the followers, the companions of Muhammad came to him and asked them if they should practice coitus interruptus as a means of contraception when dealing with their sex slaves. And they understood that the value of a pregnant female was lower than the value of an unpregnant female. So they actually had a concept of, assigning the value. Maybe that applies to some of these words like a fugitive slave that's male, a female slave, abik, ama, gilman, a male slave, usually a boy, gulam, a modern term for a slave. I mean, it goes on and on. A gura is a slave worth 500 dirham. So I toured one of the Islamic slave markets overseas. I've seen some different situations, but in one of them, the women were required to wear different headdress to reflect how many times they had been married previously, how many children they had, and how many male children versus how many female children. So the value at the auction time was dependent on how many the items that they wore in their headdress. But we were talking about vocabulary. There's also many, many names. Let me read some of these boys' names, male given names: Abdul Azim, Abdul Ali, Abdul Alim, Abdul Aziz, Abdul Bari, and it goes on for page after page. And the reference, of course, is slave of the Most High, slave of the responder, slave of the glorious, slave of the kind, slave of the mighty, and so on and so forth. So the word slave, as you were saying before I skipped your record, sorry, you were saying that there's all of these references in Arabic to the word slave. So something that's prevalent in the culture would have more vocabulary terms, right?
Exactly. If you're dealing with them, just say, taking the idea of a pilot. A pilot has all kinds of technical terms that he uses. He has a vast vocabulary. As a matter of fact, one of the ways one professional can recognize another one is if they share the professional vocabulary. That is, an attorney talking to someone else could quickly discover that he must be an attorney.
I imagine that weathermen and pilots find all of the various words for clouds
Yes,
extremely important to their careers and life-saving in terms of
yes.
the types of clouds and what they portend. So, and Muhammad had various kinds of slaves. Here's a part from your book where you're taking it directly from the Quranic tradition of Sharia. Yahya took an old woman of Hawazin as a captive and said as he took her, I see that she is a person of standing in the tribe, and her ransom may well be high. When Muhammad returned the captives at a price of 6 camels each, Vanya refused to give hers back. Vahir told him to let her go, for her month was cold and her breasts flat. She could not conceive, and her husband would not care, and her milk was not rich. So he let her go for the 6 camels. When Zuhair said this, they allege that when Vanya met Al Akra later, he complained to him about the matter, and he said, by God, you didn't take her as a virgin in her prime, nor even as a plump, middle-aged matron. I mean, this kind of uh, blatant sexism is really astonishing to find codified within a religious tradition, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But I love that expression. Her breasts are flat and her mouth is cold. I mean, this is fairly cold. The whole discussion is. I
Yeah.
mean, they're talking about it like they're selling They're like, well, they are selling camels.
Actually, yeah, because the value of the camel is being exchanged for the value of the woman.
Right,
So
right.
the camels are being sold and the woman is being sold. I see. So
Yeah.
it's two parts of a transaction. It's just astonishing. And it's like, why don't they examine her teeth as well? You know, like you would with a horse.
I'll bet you they do.
I bet you.
By the way, since we're talking about slaves and price, what is the, for records, slave records were kept for centuries. And what was the slave that brought the highest price over the centuries? A white
Yes.
woman.
Oh,
Now, why
that's
was it a white woman? Well, Muhammad had sex slaves, and his favorite sex slave was a light skinned Egyptian girl. So, therefore, if Muhammad's favorite sex slave is a white girl, then if you're a Muslim, then the best you could aspire to is to be like Muhammad. So, therefore, you'd be looking for white women. And so the price was raised in bids for women. As a
can
matter of
I
fact, there's a whole discussion about the different virtues of the different nationalities of people that you can take slaves from. But I've read this in other places where the highest priced slave was always the white woman.
and then even down to today, the Yazidi sex slaves that
Yes.
were traded amongst the ISIS fighters bore the highest price. And anyone who's interested can look up on Google Yazidi bride market, and you'll see how the girls were bought and sold by ISIS fighters, and they were practicing their faith, their religion in doing that.
By the way, one of the bigger disappointments in my life was to see when they were taking sex slaves how little anyone really cared. The feminists, there was no outrage. They were also taking Christian sex slaves. Did the churches become outraged? No, it's just boo doo 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 doo
Yeah.
doo. Did you say something? Oh, sex slaves. So what I find is that it's interesting. White people are perfectly willing to take the burden of their slavery and their past. I'll give you an example that disgusted me. The Archbishop of Canterbury in Britain did this walk where he went from his, I don't know, cathedral to the market where slaves were brought in, and he walked in chains. Here's the real deal. It is true that there was a time when Christians were involved in slavery, but it was not part of their doctrine. And so here we have, it is part of the doctrine of Islam, and yet Christians, oh, we were so bad, we were involved in slavery, but they refuse to take credit for the fact that all the slaves that were brought here came from Islamic slave markets in Africa. So
Hmm.
we're perfectly willing to bemoan our own past and not recognize the fact that who ended slavery? Britain and then America.
Hmm.
And yet we get people are Americans and others are not willing to take credit for that, but they're more than willing to take credit for, oh, we enslaved the black man. We're such terrible people. We're awful people. well, you may be awful people, but at least you take some credit for what you did, which good, which was it
Right.
was Christians who ended slavery in the world trade. Now, by the way, it is still practiced on the continent of Africa. I've spoken with a man who has traveled to Africa to buy slaves. And by the way, do you know what you can buy a slave for? About $40.
Oh. There are slave markets now in Libya. Of course, the Arab slave markets, they were the wholesalers who brought the slaves to the coast. They
Yes.
transported slaves all the way from the south of Sudan and what had been called Nubia, all the way across the Sahara up to Al Maghreb or parts of Libya. And it's an active slave trade today. And you just don't see any outrage from feminists, from Black Lives Matter. No one is jumping on a boat to go over and try to end slavery where it actually exists today. But although our ancestors had no slaves, we're supposed to feel responsible and guilty about something that happened 130 years ago for a very short period of time in U.S. history. It's certainly terrible, yes, but it was, as you say, it was the Christians that ended the international slave trade almost universally.
This is true.
So you're welcome, right? Some thanks are in order.
By the way, let me give you an example of ignorance. It's not just white people and Christians who are ignorant. Do you remember a man by the name of Muhammad Ali, a boxer?
Yeah.
What was his original name?
Cassius
Cassius
Clay.
Clay. Now, Cassius Clay was a white man, but he was an abolitionist. So Cassius Clay dropped the name of his white man name, who was an abolitionist, that is, who tried to end slavery, and took on the name of Muhammad and Ali, both of whom were slave traders.
It's
Now,
tremendous
the
blind.
irony of this surely does not escape anyone.
Can I speak about another one of his slaves? Uh, this is from 1980 in, I believe you're quoting Ibn, one of the, well, you'll catch the reference, but the footnote is not readily available for me, sorry. When Zayd had raided the Firuza tribe, he and others were injured. Zayd swore he would never have sex until he avenged his injuries. When he was well, Muhammad sent him against the Fazara. He was successful and captured some of the women. One of them was an old woman, Kufa, whose husband he had killed. Zayd tied a rope to each leg of Kurfa and tied each rope to a camel and pulled her apart. Her daughter was taken captive and passed around to 3 different men to use as they would for their pleasure. Interesting tradition to be, to memorialize in the life of Muhammad.
This is not just the life of Muhammad, this is the sunnah of Muhammad, which means it is the perfect example of human behavior. This is sacred behavior. This event, which you've just read, I think is one of the more disgusting events in the history of Islam. But again, no one is outraged. Indeed, the biggest thing that puzzles me about my study of Islam, which I've done since I was 30 years old, so I've been studying this subject for over 40 years, is that no one cares at all or even wants to discuss things that are done, such as the event we just described here, pulling a woman apart. There's no outrage. There's no outrage when it happens today. There's no outrage in its history. There's only the guilt of our own history, but the Islam has no history that anyone criticizes. I mean, Christians, for instance, can't even explain how Iraq went from being Christian to Islamic, and on and on. We are willfully ignorant on the subject of Islam. My biggest mistake in writing these books, Wes, was I thought when I wrote these books, people would read things like you just said and be so outraged that they would do something. But I've discovered you cannot outrage people anymore with what Islam does. 9/11, they weren't outraged by that except for a week or two, and now then that's all in the past.
Well, even the girls of Rotherham, England, have experienced Islamic oppression firsthand. So, bringing it right up to the present day, many of these men explained that they had a sexual emergency that needed to be satisfied, or they had a need, or they just say this is what we do culturally, right? They don't offer any defense, and
Well, they need to
politicians.
offer a defense because these men were not attacked by the police or social workers because they were Muslims.
Hmm.
So therefore, they could brag about it. I mean, they could offer videos of what they did to these girls, and it would not outrage anybody. The feminists are completely morally bankrupt. I'm a man who's been married to the same woman for over 50 years. I have 2 daughters, granddaughters. I love women in every way and at all stages of life. But I am capable of being outraged by how they're treated. However, that means I'm not a feminist because feminists are not at all outraged by anything that Muslims do to women. Nothing.
Hmm. It's 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 really truly astonishing that there's the silence is deafening, and British politicians knew what was going on, and now it's come out that a great deal of money exchanged hands to allow some of these things to go on, and the police were more afraid of being called racist than they were of stopping what was happening to British society. It's also it's basically a genocide when you do that to people. When you take a young person and you make them incapable of pair bonding or wanting to grow up and raise a family. I mean, they're stealing the future, not just the present. They're actually destroying that person's psyche. That woman's damaged forever. So, and I believe they know what they're doing in that as
Oh,
well.
I think that Muhammad was the greatest warrior who ever lived. No one dies today for Caesar, Alexander the Great, or Napoleon, but someone today died because of Muhammad. And his concept was universal war. So, what he was able to take, any aspect of civilization, and turn it into a weapon for Islam, the hijab, slavery, whatever, Islam
Democrats.
can make it a weapon of jihad. And by the way, when I say jihad, the real meaning of jihad is not war. There's several forms of jihad, which include the jihad of the sword, but there are many kinds of jihad. And one of the ways that Muhammad was able to do is to take food, halal food, education. That is, Muslims are not allowed to go to public schools in which the real history of Islam is taught. So it goes on and on and on. Again, I'll repeat this. Muhammad was the greatest warrior who ever lived because subjugating the women in a tribe by rape means that you crushed the spine and the morals of the males as well. So it leaves a permanent damage.
Mm-hmm.
So this business of taking sex slaves is highly demoralizing, and it is very fearsome to the people you attack. So it's all the better that you just give up and submit.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, slavery is the ultimate submission. There are two principles of Islam: submission, and which is what in everything we must all submit to the Sharia, and the other is dualism. Everything has at least two expressions. This dualism is one of the things when people read the Quran, they're like, well, what is this? This sounds beautiful and wonderful, but this is terrible. Well, and so then the Western mind goes, well, which of these is the right answer? Is it the good answer or the bad answer? And the answer is good and bad. It's both of them, just as it needs to be. So a Muslim can be very friendly to a kafir, or they can be very cruel to a kafir. It all depends on what their needs are, but both behaviors are exactly correct. There are over 13 verses in the Quran which state that a Muslim is never the real friend of a kafir. I think those are some of the most depressing hadith, there's those as well, most depressing Quran verses that I've read because it destroys our complete humanity. As a matter of fact, I would argue that within Islam, there is no concept of humanity. There's only the believer and the kafir.
And they're the very notion that our churches are telling us that it's the religion of peace, when actually that
Don't get me
word
started
stands
on the
for,
churches.
yeah, it stands for the submission, because so you can call it peace, but there's only peace as if you submit.
Peace
So
comes only after submission.
that's right. Then after you submit, well, then that act of constant oppression will never end. And can I read something from your book as well? Muhammad's love for one of his slaves, Mary, caused an uproar in his harem. Muhammad was fond of a Coptic Egyptian Christian slave named Mary. Hafsa found Muhammad in her room with Mary, a violation of Hafsa's domain. He told a jealous Hafsa that he would stop relations with Mary, and he did not. But Hafsa was supposed to be quiet about this matter. But the Quran points out to his wives and Muslims that he can have sex with his slaves as he wishes. Therefore, when he told Hafsa he would quit, he was not bound by that oath. And that goes back to what you're saying about the dualism. Exactly.
By the way, oaths to a Muslim, and this is oaths, well, let's say within Islam, are governed by a different doctrine than ours. One of the things is that an oath spoken with the lips is trumped by an oath hidden in the mind. So if we have a politician who's a Muslim and who is elected and people get all upset because they want to put their hand on a Quran instead of the Bible, no matter what they do, whatever oath they swear, if it's a police officer or a soldier, if they hold a mental reservation in their mind, the oath is meaningless to Allah. So therefore, our concept of telling the truth under oath does not have meaning inside of Islam. This is terrible.
Also accounts for not swearing into office on a constitution, but choosing rather to do on a Bible, but choosing to do it on the Quran, because there you're making the statement openly that you're really not bound by anything constitutional. If it's convenient, you'll hold the oath. If it's not, you won't, and so it goes. Can I ask you about chapter 4 in your book? And just to remind everyone, we're discussing the doctrine of slavery and Islamic institution. Muhammad and slavery. In chapter 4, Muhammad was surrounded by slaves all of his life. Muhammad, the white man, owned many slaves, including black slaves. And we'll get back to Muhammad Ali with that as well, because everyone in the prison conversion industry to Islam is telling the prisoners that Islam is the black man's religion, whereas Christianity is a white man's religion. But slaves played a part in every aspect of Muhammad's life, including building his pulpit. Muhammad bought and sold slaves in both retail and wholesale lots.
Yes.
Sex slaves were part of Muhammad's harem, and Muhammad gave slaves as gifts and received them as gifts. I mean, if this were anything that Jesus had ever come near, we would never hear the end of it, right?
Correct.
Any comments about those ideas about Muhammad's interaction with slaves generally in terms of that business model? Because I have 2 points from your book that were interesting. What do you think Muhammad used to sit and talk about with his young Christian slave? I think it would be great to hear what these conversations were about. Because Muhammad used often to sit at the booth of a young Christian slave called Jabir. The Meccans used to say, the one who teaches Muhammad most of what he brings is Jabir, the Christian slave. Then Allah revealed in reference to their words, we well know that they say only a mortal teaches him. The tongue of him at whom they hint is foreign, and this is a clear Arabic tongue. It's just astonishing. I wonder what they were talking about.
Well, what the Meccans were saying was, look, if you read the Quran, it is a derivative work. By that I mean its contents are found elsewhere. And so therefore, they're saying, well, look, he just gets these stories from this Christian slave, and then he tells them to us as revelations. And that's what they were referring to. Now, by the way, this was not his slave. It was someone else's slave.
Okay. Jabir was someone else's slave. So Muhammad used to, it's interesting, he would go and talk to a Christian, probably to learn about Christianity.
Well, the forms of Christianity that you find in the Quran are slightly different, for instance, but without going into detail, well, anyway, next question.
Yes, sir. So this is an interesting part that I highlighted. A Muslim accumulates merit by freeing slaves. Aisha was Muhammad's wife, and she gets some easy merit here. The apostle sent him to raid them, and he killed some and captured others. Asim told me that Aisha said to Muhammad that she must free a slave. And he said, the captives are coming now. We will give you one whom you can set free.
So therefore, she got the merit of freeing the slave.
That's some easy merit, isn't it? That's some easy merit. Well, there's another point where here Muhammad wholesales female slaves to fund jihad. Quote, then Muhammad sent Sa'id with some of the captive Jewish women of Bin Qurayza to Najd, and he sold them for horses and weapons. So he actually sells female slaves for weaponry.
Well, he's financing war.
So it would be justified and
Of
rationalized,
course.
of course. Of course. Isn't it astonishing? You know, it seems that on the whole, Islam is so ingrained with slavery at all levels that it's historical, it's racial, and it's even in the world today. It seems that Islam shouldn't be able to get away from itself on this issue. It can't, right?
It gets away with anything it wants. Again, I come back to the fact that Islam is not. Christians don't become outraged. Feminists don't become outraged. Scholars don't become outraged. No, everything that Islam does gets a pass. Gets a pass. By the way, as you know, in prison in particular, they tell the black men that Islam is the slave of the black man, whereas Christianity is the religion of the black man, and Christianity is the religion of the white man. So I find it interesting. So I was talking with a prison. What do you call a minister in prison? It's
a chaplain or a
maybe I guess
prison.
chaplain would work. Anyway, he came to me and he said, "We're losing Christians in prison because they become Muslims. Can you tell me what to do about it?" I says, "Oh, I can make it stop." He says, "Really? How would you do that?" I says, "Explain to the prisoners the doctrine of slavery and Muhammad in slavery." I said, because once a black man discovers that he's joining the religion of a slaveholder, it will not be very attractive. And you know what his response to me was? "I couldn't do that. That would offend the Muslims." What do you do with that?
Offended by what is? It's astonishing. Is there any? I wonder if that chaplain shouldn't be informed that Jesus freed captives, Jesus washed other people's feet, Jesus treated the woman at the well. That's one of the interesting stories where Jesus comes into contact with a stranger at the well and treats her kindly and speaks to her, and they go on their way and there's no incident. You can't imagine, I mean, there's really no other religious tradition that offers that kind of treatment of women. And there's, of course, the story of the woman who was found in the act of adultery, and Jesus said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." You can't see Muhammad doing that, right?
Oh, you can see Muhammad picking up the stone. Oh, by the way, speaking of stoning women, did you know that the Sharia prescribes how big the stones are to be? Imagine that. Yeah, if you're gonna kill someone by stoning, there's a prescribed size. They can't be too small because they'll not hurt, and they can't be too big because it'll kill the person immediately. So therefore, we need things like baseball sized and softball sized. So the torture will go on. And by the way, the stoning is a community act. It's not an executioner like with cutting off heads. Everyone is supposed to join in on the stoning.
Yeah, yeah. The I guess people were sort of easily amused and entertained. Maybe they had so
Ugh.
much violence, it's it's very strange. Um, so that point about here's a treatment of what men got when they were vanquished, when tribes were vanquished. Muhammad got this sex slave from the Jews after he killed all of the adult males. Muhammad had chosen one of their women for himself, Ihama, one of the women of Qurayza Jews, and she remained with him until she died in his power. That means under his right hand, right? So she was a sex slave. The apostle had proposed to marry her and put the veil on her, but she said, "No, leave me in your power, for that will be easier for me and for you. So he left her. She had shown repugnance toward Islam when she was captured and clung to Judaism. So here's a woman who actually says to the prophet Muhammad, hey, just let me stay your slave. I don't want to be your wife because it's easier for me to be your slave than be your wife. She didn't want to wear the veil.
Right. By the way, notice something here. A Muslim, this sunnah, which is the example of Muhammad, a Muslim can marry a Christian, a Muslim can marry a Jew, but a Muslim female cannot marry a Christian male.
I know a couple of these women who have had children with Muslim men and have an Islamic marriage, and the guy is, I mean, it is what it is, but there's no concern about converting the woman to Islam because she's just been a vassal for his, his plowing the field, right?
And what will happen is all the children will be raised as Muslim. So therefore, whether the woman converts to Islam doesn't matter because her children will be Muslim.
It really doesn't matter, does it? So here's going back to what you said about the prison work. There's an odd item about race that must be mentioned. In America, the descendants of slavery are told that Christianity is the white man's religion. Islam is the natural religion of the black man. It is a fact that Islam is based upon the Sunnah of Muhammad. The Sunnah is exceedingly clear about race and Muhammad. Now, this gets really strange because the Hadith goes out of its way to say that Muhammad was white. So a white man who owned black slaves started the natural religion of the black man. And there are an odd number. I mean, we know more about the complexion of Muhammad, the color, the whiteness of his armpits, the whiteness of his abdomen, the whiteness of the soles of his feet, the whiteness of his hands, his face. I don't think
And when he got angry, he flushed red.
Oh.
Which is another indication of his whiteness. Yeah, no, and it keeps up with how white Muhammad is, but it also keeps up with his different slaves. He had black slaves, white slaves, female slaves. He had all kinds of slaves. Another thing is, by the way, is that if there are different names for slaves of different races. Abid, we've mentioned, is the name for a black slave. Mm-hmm. I think a Mamluk is a white slave. Mm-hmm. I've forgotten the names of the others, but so they had different names for different races of slaves. Again, we come back to the fact that this is a detailed business with a long history, and a lot of technical terms are used in it.
And that was the interaction between Europeans and the Barbary pirates. The Almoravid Empire in North Africa would routinely cross the Mediterranean or go up the Atlantic coast to capture white women, bring them back to the Almoravid Empire. And there were more white slaves in Africa than there were ever black slaves in North America. Sort of an interesting factoid. But forgotten history is filled with sad facts that we don't even know. So I guess they can't bother us anymore.
They bother me, I'll tell you that. They drive me crazy. I've spent 40 years of my life trying to get people to listen to things that like we're talking about today and realize these ideas have consequence. These ideas reflect a history that is being carried forward into the future. If you know the history of Islam and the doctrine of Islam, you can predict the future in Islam. And yet we're like, I know this Muslim at work, he's a nice person, end of discussion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me give you an example of, by the way, that Christians try to deal here is that they want to convert Muslims by charm and just liking them, which has never successfully worked at all. That is, just preaching the gospel doesn't work. I know people who are able to convert many Muslims, about thousands actually. And what they do is they do not teach the Muslim about Christianity. They first teach the Muslim about Muhammad and the Quran. And once they see what Muhammad and the Quran really are, and most Muslims don't really know these details, suddenly they're wanting to become into Islam is less attractive to them. And so one of the things if you're going to deal with people, you want to convert black Muslims to Christianity is you'd want to explain about Muhammad the slave trader. Mm-hmm. By the way,
essentially.
I taught for 8 years at a black university here in Tennessee. The knowledge that blacks have of this information is zero,
Hmm.
just zero. Now they have a constant rash, historical rash about the white man in slavery, but the wholesalers of slaves, they don't know, they don't care, they don't bother. And if you tell them, it's like water off a duck's back.
Hmm. And of course, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but it was Christians that ended the international slave trade and
Yep.
stopped it in the Atlantic Ocean and stopped it in all of the colonial realms. It was put to an end. In fact, the British Crown spent loads of money buying slaves out of captivity and freeing them because the landowners wouldn't give up their legal right to own those slaves. So, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of forbidden knowledge on this topic that really ought to be shared and discussed. And the overall impact of your book is tremendous, and it's The Doctrine of Slavery in Islamic Institution by Dr. Bill Werner. And I want to ask you, in a general sense, does your background as a scientist of a hard science inform your work as a moral philosopher and a historian? Is
Well,
there?
obviously it does. I keep going back to fact, fact, fact. Look, my books are nothing but a collection of facts, not opinions. I'm not interested in people's opinions. I'm interested in the facts of the matter. And so that's all I try to do is to teach the facts of the matter. In some cases, I'm successful. In some cases, people are desperately afraid that they'll learn something about Islam, which cause them to have to do something. And so a person such as myself that has facts, 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 they just like water off a duck's back. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to talk about it. They have this bizarre idea that somehow or another I could not understand Islam. That's one of the strangest intellectual assumptions. Oh, Bill, you couldn't understand Islam. But you're telling me I can't understand Islam, but an illiterate peasant in Egypt can understand Islam and become a Muslim?
Mm,
I don't think so.
right. And maybe the people who understand Islam uh, most of all are the oppressed and suppressed who are under submission, so to speak, and exist as slavery. There was some outrage on social media a couple of years ago when a woman in a Middle Eastern country shared a photograph of her slave that she was gifted by a woman in another Middle Eastern country, and she praised the virtues of this slave. She would wake up early in the morning and not care if she was beaten and not care about cooking the meals. And she was just an excellent slave. And that went out on social media. But again, like the silence of the feminists, it's a really bad movie. And it's the reality for some people. It's not just a movie. It's not some out of Africa uh, historical film. It's actually here today. And Roots, the movie Roots, I remember crying as a kid when I watched that film, but that film successfully propagandized. But Arab traders, I mean, in fairness, Arab traders were actually, they made a short appearance in Roots. But let's face it, I mean, to bring the American family together, and I mean blacks and whites and all of the people of all different races to get along with each other, there has to be some acknowledgement um, that the history of Islam is being glossed over, and we're being sold a bill of goods that is not worth six camels.
No, we have to change the circumstances. I was a professor for 8 years. And so what my whole job is to simply try to teach people the facts of Islam. If you don't believe what I say, look it up. Look it up.
You've really done it by the numbers, sir, and your book is tremendous. Again, it's The Doctrine of Slavery in Islamic Institution, and you can find it at the website politicalislam.com. Dr. Bill Werner has many fascinating videos at that website, many connections with social media. You can follow his Twitter account. You can contact him for a local speaking engagement in your own community. Of course, we're in the sixth day of the of the Wuhan Wu flu China virus lockdown here in Minnesota. So we can't congregate anymore, but we adopt, and improve. And that's why, Dr. Werner, we're going online with a lot of these activities and taking them straight to people where they live. And it's tremendous. There's many more participants because we're online, sir.
Do you know the most interesting thing, most interesting thing about our conversation here today? You are the first person to ever interview me about slavery.
Uh, that's astonishing.
You're the first person. People don't want to know this stuff.
That's just this to me is such an important issue. You know, I knew so many African American gentlemen who converted to Islam, and I had to say that some of them were some very nice gentlemen, and they felt it was what they had to do to change their lives. And I could never understand how they were hoodwinked because they were really, I'm certain for a lot of other people, conversion to this doctrine of slavery, uh, well, it can confirm their biases so that it almost, what do you say, it excuses their behaviors. Converting to this kind of doctrine will make what they want to do, their baser instincts, legitimate because they're
Exactly.
following. Yeah. Well, for other people, they just don't know what they've gotten themselves into, I think. And knowledge is power, isn't it, sir? And I find it hard to believe I'm the first person who's interviewed you on the topic of slavery. It's so important, and it cuts right to the root of what's happening in American society today. And thank you for your time and your research.
Oh, well,
You
thank you for your interest.
keep up the work.
I'll
Thank you.
do it.
Thank you,
Have a
sir.
nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.